Okay, my name is John Weiss. I'm a pianist, vocalist, and sometimes a teacher of music, raconteur, and just general man of affairs. I would like to talk about my relationship with Bapuji Tisziji Munoz, which goes back quite a ways till the year 1979 when I left my studies at University of Buffalo. Actually, I graduated University of Buffalo around 1976 with a master's degree, and I hung out in the area of Rochester until 1979 for about 3 years, playing up there with various people. And in between, going back and forth to New York, and I did a job when I got back to New York with a bassist named John Burr, who mentioned that he had worked with Tisziji, and he mentioned a few things that Tisziji had said, namely that people who smoke weed, marijuana, would be debilitated by absorbing the vegetative consciousness of the weed. And I thought that was a pretty profound statement. And in 1976, I became a devotee of a movement and a spiritual path called Eckankar, path of soul travel. And the main reason I became involved, one of the main reasons I became involved with Eckankar was because I had gone to Buffalo in '76 to check out to see if I could get admitted to the graduate school there, and or a little before '76, let's say '75, and approximately around that time, maybe a little earlier. And I had seen one of their flyers, one of their Eckankar newspapers, and there was a picture of Rabbi Zartars, who was a very striking individual, who's a 400-plus-year-old Tibetan Lama who was very instrumental as one of their Ek masters, Rabbi Zartars, and I was quite taken by that picture, and I said, man, I have to find out who this cat is. You know, I got a beam, kind of a direct beam from this periodical. And anyway, I was up there being interviewed to maybe taking some exams to be able to get admitted to the graduate school. Their admission requirements were somewhat strict. And I went into the practice room and started playing, and this crazy dude came in, one of these kind of like wandering hippie types with shaggy hair and beard, and and he had the paper also, the Eckankar paper. So I said, well, what is this, and who is this cat? And he mentioned that there was this Eckankar, and there was a building. Well, they had a small center on an adjoining street to the university, and he explained stuff about the path and so forth and so on. Very strange encounter, and I never saw this guy again ever in my life. He was just kind of wandered in and out. Anyway, getting back to Tisziji, so I was a member of Eckankar, and I had made, which they call it the spiritual science of soul travel, and it was basically founded by this man named Paul Twitchell, who I had studied with various gurus, including Kirpal Singh, and then apparently according to him, went to India and met up with somebody named Sudhar Singh, and was eventually introduced to Rabbi Zartars, who came to him more or less in his astral body to give him instruction, and he wrote quite a few books and founded this whole spiritual movement or spiritual path. Anyway. So I called, and I called up to Tisziji, and I said, I heard these statements about you. He was living on 3rd Street on the Lower East Side at the time, in about a fifth floor walk up with his family, and mentioned I was very interested in meeting him, and he was a little hesitant to see me, and but eventually, after a brief, I told him about my music, and I'd like to bring over my music. I had just done, what we would call a demo tape at the time. It wasn't really good enough quality for a CD, but I mean, I had recorded with some original tunes. I had recorded with some cats I was playing with in Rochester, in the area, good musicians, and I eventually went over to East 3rd Street, went up to his apartment, and entered the room, and lo and behold, I saw a big picture of Rebbe Zartars on the wall, just greeting me, and I think one or two other masters. And I was, really, I was stunned. I said, wow, is there a connection? So we started talking, chatting, and I played him my music, which he didn't particularly care for. And then he said, well, check out this and this, he I think he gave me his record that he had done. He had finished a record with on the Indian Navigation label, which was a small label, with Bernie Sininsky, his piano player. I forgot the other musicians that were. Cecil McBee, I think, was on the record. It was a very interesting record, And he did a few originals and some. I think he did Climb Every Mountain, a show tune, very up tempo, and then he had told me about his work with Pharaoh Sanders earlier. This is toward the end of 1979. Anyway, we struck up a relationship, and particularly through the connection with Eckankar, and I was very impressed with his spiritual knowledge and his just general demeanor and his musical abilities and talents, and music in general. His work as a composer. So I would go over there once or twice a week. I was living on the Upper West Side at the time, and I would write up music for him. He'd play a bunch of stuff, and we wrote up Song for All Children. Boy, that was a long, involved project, because the whole piano part he had written. There was a whole piano part on if you know the Song for All Children, there's a long obligato piano part, arpeggiated piano part, which is fairly complicated, moves through a lot of different harmonies. And I wrote out that and quite other Venus and quite other the compositions, and I was very impressed by his. Although he wasn't, a schooled musician in the sense of new theory, or he was very advanced harmonically in that he was doing a lot of chord superimpositions, like one triad on top of another. His songs kind of harmonically moved in a certain progression, which had I could tell it wasn't just a progression based on standard chord changes or I got rhythm changes or something like that, which jazz musicians usually do. Confirmation that usually play with. His progressions were much more elevated than that, and had to do with a spiritual progression or a more, let's say, profound harmonic insight into the way music works and the structure of music. But this was all done through in a kind of spontaneous way. In other words, he wasn't thinking about superimposing chords, one chord on top of another necessarily. He just heard all these harmonies, and we wrote down quite a number of compositions and chord progressions. Some of them were like Venus originally was just a chord progression. I think he put a melody on top of that later. Persecution was from that period. Then I had I think I had a Korg, some kind of Korg synthesizer, which had an arpeggiator on it, and I think I sold it to Tisziji. I don't remember clearly. And then he got a hold of the Korg synthesizer. I didn't need it anymore because that was a pretty primitive synthesizer, and I had moved on to the DX7 or something like that, more sophisticated keyboards that I was using to gig, with left-hand bass and so forth and so on. And then he started to do amazing things with the Korg synthesizer, like with the arpeggiator. Most of the stuff, which has been lost, by the way, because a lot of this stuff was on cassette tapes, and as far as I know, it's lost. It hasn't been, it's who knows where it is, interred someplace. Anyway, there was one thing called he did with the arpeggiator, which makes automatic arpeggios. So he would just play these chords, and then it would make these fast arpeggios up, and then called "In a Starry Night," which is a very profound piece, really, out there, and very interesting. And then I was involved with his first record that he did called Visiting This Planet, right. And there were a lot of people on that record, including Bob Moses, and I think Bernie was on there, and Don Pate. And Liebman, was he on that record? Yeah, Dave Liebman was on. There's quite a few people anyway, and they did that. And Paul Schaefer was very involved with that. He did a lot of the background synth recordings. I did one song on that, Song for All Children. And I was involved in I used to go out to the Quasar. Quasar was the name of the producer, but his studio out there in Brooklyn, we used to go out there and hang out and work on. He used to work on mixing it, and I was involved with that. And we did some concerts around New York at some, I think it was the Jazz Forum, or one of the big, like kind of loft venues that he would, do concerts. There was some jam sessions, some playing going on as well at different people's places. So those days, which would be the early 80s, there was, the scene was much looser, and people had lofts downtown. They could afford to, they didn't have to pay $5,000 a month rent for a loft. They had a loft for $300 or $400 a month, so that they were having jam sessions. There was a much more of a free interaction of musicians and so forth and so on, much more creative interplay of exchange of ideas, music. And I encountered several of his old friends from California, Guillermo Cantu, a drummer. I don't know what happened to him. And he was involved also. I think he played on this record, Visiting This Planet, if I remember correctly. And anyway, at this time, I think Tisziji was pretty involved in astrology, and he gave me a reading, and it was a profound revelation to me, what he told me about my personality based on astrological, my astrological configuration, my chart, having, for example, a moon in Scorpio, for example. I realized why I was such an arrogant, dickhead a lot of the time. So, because I had the moon in Scorpio. I mean, not that it was a justification, but but it was very insightful. And then he, so at that time he was giving readings and gave me a few astrology books, and I found him to be, kind of like the same with music. Like at the, like out of nowhere, he was like kind of like the most profound astrologer I've ever run into, at the top of his field, in astrology. I mean, it was like, going back to ancient Babylonia and, finding some, Chaldea, whatever, Chaldean astrologer who was like, the head, the Merlin of astrology. He had that kind of facility. Then he kind of got away from astrology and didn't want to deal with it anymore, because it was, he was more, I guess, into much more profound wisdom and visions and so forth. I also heard something of his spiritual ideology in terms of his own revelations of how he met, who did you, the Tibetan guy you met on 23rd Street? Who was that?
Karmapa.
Yeah, Karmapa. Yeah, and so a few stories of that nature of his experiences, and I had some experiences with him as well. In that, I remember one time because a lot of times. he did not have a great deal of followers at that time. And so a lot of times it was just him and me in a room and talking, and I witnessed some, let's say, phenomena, very, movements or astral movements. At one time I saw he actually saw him glowing and being surrounded by flames, in a sense. But there weren't literal flames, but that's the best way I could describe it, like a certain glowing energy. And at other times I felt myself moving, or certain movements going on in the room, and certain transpositions that kind of altered state of reality would occur, through these interactions. And so I realized I was in the presence of a very, profound and deep and highly evolved spiritual master. And I had been around other people as well. I mean, previous to that, I was initiated by Muktananda, and then I had, found Ekankar, and I also had hung out with Vishnu Devananda, another guru, yogi actually, who had a place in Canada and also in the Bahamas. He passed on quite a while ago. And I was around him, and, not that I had that much personal interaction with him. He didn't really, have much, concern for me, particularly one way or the other. I talked to him a few times, but I was around him, and I went through his meditations, and sometimes he would lead the meditations himself, and so on and so on. And I had spent quite, I would say, 3 weeks here, 2 weeks there, in the company of these people. So I had been around other gurus and even the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, in fact, a little bit before the Beatles ran into him, I kind of ran into him. So I've been exposed to different gurus and teachers, and I found Tisziji to be on a very high level. And then there was a split in the movement of Ekankar, which had a very profound effect on the membership, because Ekankar is a system it's a hierarchical system, and it's based on initiations, and every initiation has a certain name. Like the fifth initiation, they call it a Mahdi, where you're supposedly soul realized. And what happened was the original founder of Ekankar, Paul Twitchell, died, and presumably he was poisoned. Probably he was poisoned. That seems to be the consensus of what happened to him by, the peaceful and loving Christians of the planet. Some of them who resented some of his statements about Jesus. He made some, pretty radical or pronouncements about Jesus and Christianity. Basically, he did not have much. He did not put much stock in any kind of organized religion, Christianity or any other type of organized religion, and he tried to place Jesus basically in the hierarchy of Ekmasters, in some kind of relationship with them as a spiritual teacher, and this apparently caused a lot of antagonism among certain Christians. So supposedly he was poisoned, and then the movement was taken over by somebody named Darwin Gross. And Paul died kind of suddenly, and Darwin was really not prepared for to assume the role of Ekmaster. But he did it, and he was Ekmaster for about 10 years. And I think he had difficulties with the job, and he developed a lot of back problems. And he was a musician too, but more of a lounge musician. He played the vibraphone, but he did have a certain spiritual power. I encountered him on the inner, and I went to several events where he was speaking, and saw his presence. And I said I met him on the inner a couple of times, so it still had a certain validity for me. And then the movement split apart based on the fact that Darwin didn't want to be the Eckmaster anymore. I guess he couldn't handle it physically, the strain of being the Eckmaster. It involved writing and dealing with thousands of students and people with different initiates, and they call them Echinitiates, and a lot of administrative work and so forth, traveling, and so he couldn't hack it basically physically. I don't think he had it wasn't good enough physical stamina or good enough shape to be able to really cut the gig. And so he turned the reins, or what they called the rod of power, the Eck rod of power, over to another master, supposedly a disciple of his, named Sri Harold Klemp. And as soon as that happened, very shortly thereafter, about a year afterwards, Klemp said that Darwin wasn't a real master, and he had done several nefarious things, which I'm not really clear what they were, probably having to do with cooking the books or taking money off or whatever. There was some kind of, basically became a political fight between the old master, who was Darwin Gross, and the new master, who was Sri Howard Klemp, who said that Darwin Gross was like Malach. He was like kind of a monster. I don't know where he came up with Malach, because it's a Jewish, monster, and I don't think Klemp was Jewish. But anyway, he came up with that term, and so the movement basically had a big schism, so to speak. And lo and behold, Darwin called up Tisziji, which I'm not sure exactly how he got a hold of Tisziji, but maybe Tisziji had written him a letter or made contact with him. Tisziji went out to meet with Darwin and his secretary, Bibi, who was originally Paul Twitchell's secretary, and offer his advice or his counsel or whatever. And they wanted him to be, ally himself with Darwin, but he didn't want to get involved in the politics of it. But he wrote a very profound book about the whole issue called Once is for Always, which has to do with the fact that once someone has achieved a certain level of mastership, or in this case, it was about a ninth initiation to become the Eck Master in Eckankar, and it could not be taken away from him simply by saying that by one of his disciples or somebody else in the organization saying that he was not a master, and so forth and so on. That once you achieve this level of realization and freedom and whatever you want to call it, self-realization, God realization, that it cannot be taken away simply through political and or disagreements between factional disagreements that have to do with materialistic concerns such as money, membership, and power. And it was a very profound book, and nobody else kind of laid down the law like Tisziji did in this book, Once is for Always. And it will remain a kind of definitive book about the whole lineage of gurus and the guru-chela relationship. Basically, it remains a classic in that, as far as describing that whole process.
And would you have described yourself at any point as a student or a disciple of Tisziji?
Yeah. Yes. As soon as I as soon as Eckankar split apart, I then identified as being a student of Tisziji, a disciple of Tisziji, because I realized he had a more profound and deeper spiritual insight and spiritual power than the masters that I had been exposed to, particularly the gurus, although I didn't know Muktananda that well. I just had gotten initiated with him through his Shakti power, which is very, very powerful. He was a very powerful cat, Muktananda, but supposedly he became, involved in some few sex scandals of one kind or another. Not really having to. I'm not really sure what they dealt with, but some of the women kind of mentioned this, and so that kind of. And then he died, and the two people. The movement was taken over by a brother and sister, and they ended up having a big falling out and a big political schism between those two. So that kind of did that in for me. And then Eckankar had the schism, and Vishnudevananda was more of a traditional yogi. He was more into doing the hatha yoga and the traditional mantra meditation, which led me into new avenues in my life, so to speak. I started singing when I started singing in his 3-hour meditations, all those beautiful chants that he had organized and arranged. Then I realized I could sing. I had a voice. It started to develop my voice and so forth and so on. And I gained a certain, spiritual knowledge through his, that yogic process, but not to the degree of that I felt with Tisziji. And also I was very influenced by his advanced musical abilities and thinking and playing without him seeming to have studied without any formal musical education, so to speak. So that was very impressive. So I realized he was a true original and a true natural,
So experientially, what was the difference between sitting with Tisziji and being in student-teacher relationship with Tisziji and the prior spiritual experiences that you'd had?
Well, I mean, I never was in these movements, these mass movements. You really don't have that much contact with the guru. It's a very for example, Eckankar, the way that's organized, you have satsangs, but the satsang is run by a satsang leader who is supposed to be a fifth initiate according to their system, but is not always a fifth initiate. Usually, they're pretty okay as people, but they're not, like I would say, an enlightened, guru, And then you have the guru who's very remote from most of the people, most of the chelas, and then you have, of course, the gurus, so to speak, either the inner master, which is basically the it's kind of like the I don't know what you would call a direct connection to the higher consciousness would be the inner master, and also the hierarchy of ascended masters like Rabbi Zartars, Gopal Das, all these people, Fubi Quants. Some of them were alive, some of them weren't alive, but they were all alive on the other higher planes. But you conceivably could have contact with them in a dream state, but you would not have direct contact with them. So most of my experiences prior to Tisziji had to do with stuff that I had in, let's say, dream states or on the inner, what Eck would refer to as the inner, mostly in a dream state, very vivid dream states of various kinds of contact with, masters and so forth and so on, and transmissions of information. And then when I met Tisziji, after sitting with him, I experienced, the energy from and the force of a true spiritual master, so to speak.
So, what would you say is the most important thing you learned from Tisziji?
The most important thing I learned. That's a hard question to answer. Because the most important thing I learned was basically, according to him, is to keep my mouth shut, and listen. So that's a hard thing to talk about, So, but I guess you would say just a manner of his approach to life, which has no concern whatsoever for material success or material recognition, or all these elements that most people are striving for in from an ego point of view. So just to drop the whole ego, point of view, and the whole identification with yourself as this grand persona, this grand personality, and just to become a channel of what it is, wisdom, and to try to be, to bring, some kind of realization and some kind of healing spiritual energy into the world. I guess that's what I learned from him. And I have never seen him or known him, and I can verify this as a witness, having known him since 1979, despite his many opportunities to, do world tours, or, his association with Paul Schaefer, or Phil Ramone, the big macho head of the Grammys, who was quite taken by him. I've never seen him cater to any of these people, or to try to use them, or even his musical abilities to attain any kind of financial or to fame or lucre, so to speak. In other words, you've never used any of these connections or his profound musical abilities to create a financial or a musical success for himself at all, to any extent. He's always rejected all of this. Almost in a very nonchalant manner, and like it's irrelevant to him. So you have to to anyone, particularly if you're involved with the music business and the striving for success that most musicians try to achieve and fight for, and scrape for, and whatever, spend years practicing for, to have him just disregard this and not have it have no importance whatsoever for him, it should give you, food for thought, or make you, realize that we're doing with some other kind of being here. Now, a lot of musicians haven't picked up on this. I can run off, we have Bob Moses, who of course is, became his student, and John Medeski, but of those two, I could probably run off, 20 famous musicians, or, well-known, wonderful players that have passed through Tishiji's orbit and his presence, and not, picked up on it. Some great players, and just even though they realized he was, a musical genius in a certain sense, very phenomenal musician and guitar player, they never were receptive to his teachings to any degree. So, it's not just a question of being a musician, obviously, or being a great musician or an excellent player, or being able to hear what he's doing. you have to have a certain receptivity to his teachings and a receptivity to the teachings in general, to a certain degree of spiritual, I hate to use the word, attainment, because it sounds like egotistical, but there has to be a certain sensitivity there to what's going on in the inner worlds and the worlds that don't have anything to do with, music, success, women, and the so-called, pleasures and successes and ecstasies of life. You got to have a sensitivity to what's beyond that and what's, behind the wall of Maya. So that's unfortunately, and some of these musicians have passed on, and without receiving the great blessings that Tisziji has to offer. I mean, it's unfortunate, and some of the musicians have fallen sick or whatever that have played with him or been in his orbit, so to speak. So it's not just it goes, as far as I'm concerned, way beyond just music and his abilities and his profound musical knowledge, but spontaneous knowledge, inner knowledge of music. And the other thing is, as soon as I heard his sound, I was struck by the guitar sound. I said, there's a spiritual element in this sound. You know what I mean? It's not just, some guys will say, oh, well, he's just like a jazz version of Carlos Santana, something like that. He sounds like Santana, And I recognized right away that, that there was, from the sound, man, you put on one of his records, even the most craziest stuff, with all the free form thing everybody's playing it. Once you hear the sound, you realize there's a real spiritual force coming through that sound. I mean, it's just like boom, it's right there. It grabs you. And I don't think the other musicians that kind of passed him by or got that. They weren't grabbed by that. So I mean, how can you explain that? It doesn't really necessarily have to do that much with musical ability, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, and not to mention the real heavy-duty books that he's written, for example, Godfire Symphony. But I mean, I guess maybe in closing, the last question: do you feel as though Tisziji is a monk, and if so, like, what is that?
A monk?
A monk.
Well, I wouldn't call him a monk because, he was jumping out of planes and, supposedly, according to his biography, getting into street fights as a Puerto Rican years ago. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't exactly call that monkish behavior. He has like how many kids do you have? 3 kids? 4 kids? He has 4 kids. I mean, that's not exactly a monk. And I would consider him to be a very profound, spiritual master as a result of doing a lot of work on himself and being predestined through his birthright to assume this role and to provide this function, this guru function.
Yeah, I mean that he wasn't necessarily born a monk, but that he's given up, as you were describing, the world.
Well,
like the music world.
I mean, I have kind of bad, like monk is. I don't know if monk is a good. Renunciate would be more, I guess, appropriate, because I don't think monk is a good association, because, I've been around monks, and there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on in monasteries and so forth. So just because somebody's a monk doesn't mean that, he's necessarily on a high spiritual level or anything like that. That's my association with monks. It's more like with the Catholic monks, with the guys in the robes and there's a lot of weird stuff that's gone on through the centuries in monasteries, in general, so, which enough to delve into. But renunciate certainly, because he's not interested in the trappings of success or wealth or success or any of that stuff.
Great. Well, thank you very much.